Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Today we're looking at the Tin HiFi T2 Plus, a successor to the original T2 that's now got quite a different shell design and claims to be a very neutrally tuned IEM that should be good for everybody looking for a true representation of the recording you're listening to. As always with an IEM at this price, the question is, do the claims and the marketing stack up with the experience? The T2 Plus is listed at $60 or about 87 Australian dollars, so it's still very much a budget IEM, but it's not at that absolute basement level like IEMs such as the KBE KS2 that I reviewed recently. Tin HiFi develops quite a strong reputation as one of the best hi-fi brands out there, bringing really affordable products that actually perform pretty well. In the case of the T2 Plus, they've certainly put forward a really good product on paper and in terms of specifications. The first things you notice about the T2 Plus when you unpack them is they've got a beautiful metal shell. It's all made out of aluminium by the feel of it, or some sort of alloy, and it's beautifully molded, so it's all very smooth. It's a two-piece design, you can see where it's been joined together, but the seam can't be felt. It's just a very, very fine hairline seam, and everything is beautifully finished. On the inside of this casing is a single 10mm driver that's apparently made out of a nickel zinc alloy. Now what that should do in theory is make the driver very rigid and therefore keep the sound clean and free from distortion when the driver's doing its motions back and forth. The cable that comes with the T2 Plus is nothing short of brilliant. It's a silver-plated copper cable, which is not always my favourite because it can make the sound a little bit brighter than it should be sometimes, but everything else about the cable is absolutely fantastic. It feels supple, it's a really nice weave, it doesn't tangle easily, and they're using an MMCX connector, which I personally really like. I know some people aren't a fan of MMCX because they can come detached sometimes and IEMs can fall off, but I really like the fact that it allows the IEM to spin and also gives you a very secure connection without the risk of stretching the pin sockets and having a loose fitting connection and or having the pins bend or break if things get pushed the wrong way by mistake. I'll talk a bit more about this cable later on because it is worthy of note, particularly in a $60 IEM where other options out there on the market that cost so much more money don't match the quality of this cable. While we're talking accessories and pieces that go directly with the IEM, I should mention that in the box you get a whole range of silicone tips. So there's a whole bunch of tips in this bag. There's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 tips, so 5 pairs plus the one installed. And then you also get a pair of foam tips as well. So there's lots and lots of accessories, lots of variation you can find to get just the right fit and tweak the sound by changing the insertion depth and the level of seal that you're getting depending on the tips you use. Once you get it all set up, the next thing that's important to know is that the T2 Plus are a 32 ohm IEM with 104 decibel sensitivity. Now what that means in general terms is that the T2 Plus will play well with pretty much any device you can put them with, other than a massively overpowered headphone amp that was never designed to drive IEMs, of course. But in most cases, you'll have no issues with devices that maybe have a little bit of hiss on very sensitive IEMs. These should be fine. With devices that have higher than ideal output impedance, these should still be fine. So it basically means you're not going to hear hiss from devices that create hiss, and it means that you're not going to have the frequency response affected if you have a device that the output impedance is not ideal. And what I mean by that is generally for IEMs, you're looking for an output impedance of 1 to 2 ohms maximum or below. Whereas with a 32 ohm load like the T2 Plus, you could comfortably use it with something up as high as maybe a 4 ohm output impedance. Most devices these days that are designed for IEMs will be comfortably below that, but there are a few floating around that aren't, and that's where something like the T2 Plus becomes really versatile because it's not going to be affected by those less than perfect devices. All in all then, we're looking here at an IEM that ticks every possible box in terms of specifications, the physical design, the accessories that come with it. Everything is just right. It's looking really good. So of course the question comes down to the sound quality. As I mentioned before, these are designed and marketed as a neutral sounding earphone. So when I first put them on, I was expecting to hear things very flat, very clean, and very balanced across all frequencies. And the good news is they come through in that regard for the most part. bass is rich and full, but it's not boosted, it's just got the right amount of weight and presence. If I had to knock the bass in any way, it can be just a tiny bit slow. It's not as fast a decay as you might want it to be if you enjoy your bass really sharp and quick and punchy. I have heard other IEMs do bass that's just a little bit quicker and snappier, even dynamic driver ones, so this isn't a balanced armature versus dynamic thing. I've heard dynamics do bass a little bit quicker, but these are pretty good, so I'm not suggesting it's a drawback, it's just something to be aware of. They are a tiny bit slower than what I would call a neutral or reference level of speed. The mid-range from the T2 Plus is equally good, it's well balanced, it's solid, it's got a decent amount of weight, but it does sit a little bit behind the bass and the treble. So there's just ever so slight a hint of a V-shaped tuning to the T2 Plus, but it's extremely mild. So it's only when you put it up against something that's a lot more linear and therefore has a more forward mid-range presentation that you hear the difference between the T2 Plus and a truly linear sound. I'll give you an example of that with the comparison shortly. Finally, onto the treble. The treble's really nice from the T2 Plus, but it does occasionally, very occasionally, get a little bit too harsh for my tastes. The good news is it's so close to the edge that you can very quickly tame it with the right tip choice, the right source choice, or the right cable choice. And what I mean by that is silver-plated copper, as I said before, can bring a little bit of edge to the sound. So when I paired these up with the Aries Audio Ikigai cable that I'm going to be reviewing very soon, the sound got overall a little bit smoother and everything just sat nicely in balance. I'm not suggesting you go out and spend the sort of money that the Ikigai is worth, but at the same time, if you happen to have a pure copper MMCX cable lying around, the T2 Plus can be tamed just by switching from the SPC, the silver-plated copper cable, onto the plain pure copper cable. Likewise, if you want to stick with this cable because it is beautiful and nice to use, then you just need to change your tips slightly. I found spin fits were an excellent option at trimming the treble ever so slightly because they've got a different bore size, the hole through the middle of the tip. So little things like that can make a big difference to the T2 Plus, and it's already so good that a tiny tweak for me had it just right. I should also add that the treble is good enough that it very, very rarely got out of control for me. The track that I particularly noticed it on is from the Streets album called Original Pirate Material, and that album's made up of all sorts of samples and rapping. It's not particularly well recorded, and that's where the T2 Plus showed the poor quality of that recording. So if you're putting good sources through it and good quality material, you'll probably not have any issues with the treble, but for anyone who likes to have a wide range of music and occasionally dabbles with stuff that isn't ideal, you may want to tame the T2 Plus just ever so slightly. It also, though, might come down to personal taste. I do tend to be a little bit sensitive to treble. Finally, we should talk about the overall presentation, so the imaging size and space, etc. The imaging from the T2 Plus is really nice. It produces very much an in-head image, but it's well spread out, so the image sort of stretches from ear to ear, and vocals kind of sit up right behind the forehead. It's quite a high image in the head, so some IEMs that I listen to and headphones produce an image that's kind of in level with the ears, but I found with the T2 Plus that for some reason they're producing an image that sits higher. I found it really enjoyable because it's a bit different from the usual, and it's neither good or bad, so I wouldn't suggest anyone should take that as a pro or a con. It's just a comment about the subjective qualities of the T2 Plus's sound. Ultimately, I would say that everything about the T2 Plus's presentation makes it a fantastic IEM at the $60 price point. In no way am I disappointed that having spent $60, this is what I'm using and hearing. I've had a few viewers comment lately on the music I've been sharing in some of my reviews. So what I'm going to start doing as of this review is to start sharing some more non-audiophile tracks with you, because we're not all going to be listening to pure audiophile recordings all the time. So I'm not going to probably talk about things that are not well recorded, but anything that's well to fantastically recorded is something that I'm likely to include in my testing. So you'll find with some of the tracks I'm going to recommend today and in the future, they may not be the best recordings ever, but they're hopefully great music that you might like to check out. As always, I also welcome any suggestions from you down in the comments below of tracks that you'd like me to try. My first comparison was using the BLON BL03. These are a $40 earphone, and so they're even cheaper than the T2 Plus, but for quite a long time now, they've been considered very much one of the best options on the market. They've got some ergonomic issues that make the fit quite difficult difficult for some people. The cable's also not as good as the T2 Plus, but in the end, it's often going to come down to the sound quality and the sound signature as to which one of these you prefer. I started off with the track Sweet Pain by Blues Traveller, and what I immediately noticed was that the BL03s had more upper mid-range energy and overall were not as refined sounding. There was a sense of a bit of distortion or grain or dryness in the sound that the T2 Plus does better. The T2 Plus comes across more refined, and I'd put that down to there probably being a slightly better quality driver that's not breaking up as much and creating that extra bit of noise or hash in the upper mid-range. The BL03 also have a bit more mid-bass presence, and so what that does is it makes them sound overall a bit warmer and a bit thicker sounding, but they're not hugely different from the T2 Plus. So ultimately what I'd say is if you've got the BL03 and you're looking for a touch more refinement and probably a touch more linearity that's not quite as V-shaped, the T2 Plus are a really nice step up. There are times and tracks where I enjoy the BL03 more, but I think overall the T2 Plus is the better earphone in terms of overall technicalities and truth to source. To really test that out though, I tried another track, and that was In Love With You by Erykah Badu. This is a really nicely recorded track, and it's one that I used to use a lot for testing, but I haven't for quite a while. At the beginning of the track, the bass guitar really showed the difference between these two earphones. There was more texture and less bloat in the bass from the T2 Plus, and it made the bass sound a lot more realistic. In the case of the BL03, things got a little bit loose and a little bit warm, and I lost a lot of the texture of the bass guitar, whereas I could hear it on the T2 Plus. Similarly, when the guitar came in, the guitar had better texture once again with the T2 Plus, and it sounded a bit brittle on the BL03. Again, that's that upper mid-range quality that the BL03 has that makes things just sound a little tiny bit artificial and a little bit dry or grainy. So definitely for me, the T2 Plus came through as being worth a bit more money unless you particularly like the sound signature of the BL03. You're giving up a little bit of that rich, lush sound to get an overall more linear and truthful representation by going to the T2 Plus. So having proved that it was worth spending more than the BL03s, the question is it worth spending more again to get something even better than the T2 Plus? My test for that was the EN700 Pro from SIMGOT. I reviewed these way back at the beginning of the channel, and I've kept them ever since because I really enjoy them as a single dynamic driver, relatively affordable IEM. Their current list price is about $200 US, so it's a big jump up from the $60 T2 Plus, but sometimes that's worth the jump. For this test, I was using European Festivity Nightmare, a weird name for a track, by Turquoise. On this track, which is quite funky and with multiple vocalists, what I found was that the EN700 Pro was noticeably more V-shaped. And that's not good or bad, it's just different and depends on what you like. The T2 Plus lent slightly warmer because it's got a bit less treble energy due to the EN700 Pro's treble boost. For me, I did prefer the T2 Plus's slightly richer, warmer sound because it was less V-shaped and more linear, but again, it's going to be personal taste. Because it is less V-shaped, the T2 Plus gave much more emphasis to the mids, and I mean that in a good way. It allowed me to focus in on the mids, and it produced a soundstage that was a little bit narrower, but with a better focused image. I think for me, I would happily recommend either of these two earphones to somebody, but it's going to depend a lot on what you're looking for. If you love mid-range and you love vocals, I think the T2 Plus is better. If you're looking for something that's really engaging and energetic and you enjoy a V-shaped sound that's done really well, the EN700 Pro is still a good choice. Ultimately though, it's hard to justify spending $200 when for me, the T2 Plus is an equivalent performer. I'm not saying it's better, but it's an equivalent performer at only $60 compared to $200. And with that in mind, I'd probably only recommend the EN700 Pro if somebody really wants that V-shape. So far, the T2 Plus are taking on all comers and coming out at least on par, if not better. That led me to get curious about whether or not the T2 Plus could take it to something much more expensive that's also designed and tuned as a very linear and neutral sound. So I pulled out my trusty AudioFly AF1120s. The 1120s cost roughly 10 times the price of the T2 Plus, so you'd expect them to sound much better. We're also now putting a single dynamic driver IEM up against a multi-balanced armature IEM. The 1120s use 6 balanced armature per side with 2 per frequency band, so 2 bass, 2 mids and 2 treble. I was listening to a TV show by Martha Wainwright for this test, and it showed that the T2s do have a slightly V-shaped sound. Their treble's just a little bit brighter and more enhanced than the 1120s, which are a very smooth and, in my opinion, very linear sounding earphone. The T2 Plus just came across a bit brighter. Some people are going to like that because it does bring a bit more energy and a sense of clarity to the sound, but what it also does is it takes away the ability to hone in on the mid-range. In the same way that the T2 Plus did mid-range and focus better than the EN700 Pro, the 1120s do mid-range noticeably better than the T2 Plus. As you'd expect when you're spending 10 times the price, there was also much better nuance and texture and layering from the 1120s, partly because they're a higher priced unit that's probably using better components, but also because we're talking about 6 balanced armatures versus a single dynamic driver. The theory here being that a dynamic driver has a lot of work to do to reproduce all those frequencies effectively. When you've got multiple balanced armatures, they're each able to specialize in a particular part of the frequency range and therefore produce each area of that frequency range better and more accurately. There's no doubt in my mind that some people would prefer the signature of the T2 Plus, but there's also no denying to me that the 1120 is extracting more detail, more nuance, and more texture from the music. For me personally, the 1120s strike very close to the perfect sound signature. I know some people don't enjoy them, they find them too rolled off and too smooth, but that to me is exactly what I love about them. They are so linear that they don't boost the treble at all and they don't boost the bass at all. On a related side note, I like the cable from the T2 Plus much better on the AF1120s and vice versa. The cable from the T2 Plus brings just a little tiny bit of extra brightness and energy to the sound from the 1120s, which they do benefit from on some tracks, and it's also a far better cable than the version that came with my 1120 Mk2s. I believe for anyone that's looking at the 1120s, they've changed the cable since the ones that I bought, but this cable from the T2 Plus is far better than the version I have. And with that in mind, I would almost go so far as saying I would buy the T2 Plus just for its cable and know that the IEMs are a bit of a bonus. It's not the best cable in the world. It's silver-plated copper, which to me is a slightly inferior design. I'm not going to get into that on this review, that's a whole nother conversation, but it's just a really nice cable in a lot of situations and it feels great, which is the key for me. So with all that said, the T2 Plus becomes an IEM that I would very comfortably recommend to anybody looking to spend probably anywhere up to about $200 on a pair of IEMs. As you've heard here, it competes easily with the BLON BL03 and I think does a better job. It also easily stands toe-to-toe with the more expensive EN700 Pros from SIMGOT. So it's an outstanding performer that's comfortable, beautifully made, has a great cable and lots of different tip choices, so there's absolutely nothing not to like about it. If you're in the market for a pair of mostly neutral but ever so slightly V-shaped IEMs, I'll put a link down below where you can go and check out the T2 Plus for yourself, maybe pick up a pair and enjoy one of the best budget earphones that I think's on the market today. For now though, happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.